Hello, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is part of the Spaces virtual conference with the theme of Net Zero Carbon Climate Emergency 2021. My name is Mark Appleyard, and I'm your chair for this afternoon's webinar. Many thanks for joining us today. And before commencing with my introduction to this afternoon's speakers, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our 5 sponsors, which are Atkins, Faithful & Gould, IES, NPS Group, and Wilmot Dixon for their support. All the webinars over the 2-week period of the conference are being recorded and will be loaded onto the Spaces YouTube channel. The recordings are only available to delegates and Spaces members, and a link will be sent at the end of the conference for people to watch and listen again. If you have any questions about this webinar through the course of it, please include them in the chat box and we'll try and answer them at the end of the presentation. So the subject of today's webinar is Decarbonising Education. And this will be presented by Helen Groves and John Ridgett from Atkins. Helen is a highly experienced architect who leads the Atkins education team nationally. She's passionate about the importance of well-designed education buildings and worked with Atkins clients from the pre-concept data briefing stages through to post-delivery in order to create exciting and engaging learning spaces. John heads up the higher and further education sector in the London and Southeast regions. He's currently working with the Atkins Higher Education Research and Innovation teams to drive thought leadership on future teaching and learning spaces, as well as the journey towards net zero. Together, Helen and John work across the education sector on schools, further education colleges, and higher education projects. Their work is not only focused on buildings, but also master planning and strategic thought leadership, working alongside their colleagues in the Atkins Research and Innovation teams. Atkins is a multidisciplinary practice, and alongside their engineering and sustainability colleagues, Helen and John are working to push forward projects and solutions that support the decarbonisation of the education estate, but critically also the wider sustainability agenda. In this talk today, Helen and John will be talking about design and delivery solutions, particularly focused around new build schools and the retrofitting of university estates. Helen and John, welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for supporting Spaces 2021 virtual conference. I'll now pass the floor over to you and look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. Fantastic. And, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this conference. It's such an important topic, and the opportunity to talk about how the sector is looking at it more globally and then focusing into more specific details as to how we're responding in Atkins to the challenges, which are not only kind of citywide but nationwide and global. How do we respond to all of those? So we're going to start at the macro level and build our way in, and then we'll focus the second half of the presentation more on the higher education and particularly the retrofit and how we deal with those. So Mark has already done a fantastic job in introducing us, so I'll waste no more time on that. So if we start at the macro, what is the guidance that is brought to our door by for us as architects, by people like the RIBA, excuse me, by people like the RIBA. The important thing that we wanted to stress here was that carbon is part of a much bigger picture that needs to be looked at. So whole life carbon, both in terms of embodied and operational, cannot be viewed by itself, and it must be viewed in terms of the economic sustainability, the social elements, and the practicalities of how a project is going to develop. And that is, very much from the way that people feel about a space, how it supports the community, as well as the practicalities of things like water use and closeness to transportation. So it must be viewed in the whole, and that's something that we've got to keep very close to our hearts as we're developing projects in the round. Having said that, there's been some fantastic guidance developed over the past, particularly over the past 2 years, by LETI, and I dare say a number of you will be familiar with their work. And it doesn't stand still. They've just released this week a fantastic piece, which is about aligning the embodied carbon targets across a number of different sectors, but across a number of different disciplines as well, because there's challenges as we always have when there's a big brief development in construction. Is how do we make sure that we're all working towards the same targets? We all share the same goal, but making sure that those are aligned are incredibly important. And a lot of the work that the Letty team have been doing, which includes a number of my Atkins colleagues, has been a fantastic pointer. We'll come back to that in a few minutes' time. So in terms of what does it mean for particular clients? So we're working very closely with Cardiff City Council at the moment, and they have a vision, which is fantastic. This, as you can see on the left, the vision for carbon neutral city by 2030, and at a different scale for different challenges is something that we need to be engaging with our clients with. Now, it's a fantastic piece of work that they put together. But as we got more into the detail with them, it was, okay, so what does that mean in terms of the actual targets that Cardiff are going to present to contractors, to consultants, to say, this is what we mean, this is where we are on the journey at that particular time. So the piece of work that we've recently carried out for them is about saying, okay, we understand your priorities, we understand your vision, but what does that mean in targets, in cold hard facts, and what we're going to be measured against? And that transfer is something which we're seeing a lot of our clients do at the moment, and it's something that requires a broad brush expertise across a number of disciplines, and to actually make it real for the brief of a new project or something very particular. It's hugely important that we get to that nitty-gritty, because we all need to understand what it means in the individual project terms. One big step that's been made recently, this is the Department for Education in England, I should say, to differentiate it from the slightly different targets in Wales and Scotland, for that matter. The importance that the DFE have been targeting in terms of understanding not only the net zero target, which is obviously at the heart of central government's challenges, but also not taking that on its own journey, but making sure that it comes together with an improvement in the data and asset management. Because the more we understand the challenge, the more we can actually understand the baselines, the more we can actually work to improve them. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity to take that new journey and the opportunity to actually look at things in the whole rather than just focus on carbon. And that's been reflected in the new output specification, which is going to come out in terms of projects relatively soon, and by the end of this year. But the first time that we've actually seen this brought together in one document, which is about not only the carbon, as you can see on the lower two bullets there, but also the healthy and productive school setting and the long-term needs of the school users, the idea of well-being, the idea of the individuals and their health and well-being mattering in the wider brief. And that's hugely important and a big step forward to actually essentially codify that in a brief. And I think that's going to make a big difference to the way us as consultants, but our contractor clients, and ultimately the most important people are the users of the school, are going to benefit from that. In terms of what does that mean to a sustainable school, this is a slide which is again borrowed from the DFE in terms of their priorities. I've just realized the bottom one, I'm not sure whether you can see, I can't see because of our thumbnails, but the 10th one, thank you. The robust BIM environment is the 10th one. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. But importantly, that this reflects what I was saying at the beginning in terms of, the RIBA's guidance is very much that you've got to look at it holistically. So yes, while we're looking at, wastewater, while we're looking at carbon, we must be looking at the health and well-being targets. We must be looking at the weather files and the regulated and unregulated energy. So being very mindful that, the idea of decarbonising cannot come by itself, that it has to be as part of this wider approach. So what does that actually mean? I've come back to the Letty guidelines, because actually even when they've put some very clear guidance together, and this is the Letty design guide essentially, but for schools, and it's fantastic the way they've set this out in a really clear way. But even within that, it's worth noting that there are priorities. There are things which need to be done first, and obviously have a higher weighting than others. So if you look at the ones which I've highlighted here, so what do we prioritize out of everything that's on that page, which you think, fantastic to be able to distill it for carbon onto a single page? What do we do? So the first one is about the U values. Obviously, we need to protect and make sure that that the balance of the energy that's put into the building, we're not losing through the fabric. So prioritizing and spending the time and energy in terms of understanding, for example, the G values of the glass, whether or not to triple glaze. Very often the first reaction is we can't possibly afford that, but making sure that people understand that it's the bigger picture and to be able to prioritize those. It should go without saying, but maximizing the renewables and making sure that that is thought from the beginning, be it air source heat pumps or air and ground source heat pumps, should now be the standard option. But also in terms of PVs, in terms of things which we now know as an industry, the payback time, and those are dropping all the time and are actually becoming viable. Focus on the materials. Focus on the materials for embodied carbon, particularly on the superstructure and the finishes. And because of the ease of measuring, we often focus as consultants on the frame itself, but actually understanding that it's part of that continuum. So if the superstructure is, as it says there, 30% of the total, and the internal finishes are 21, really understand that prioritization when we're looking at the carbon measuring, because the big hits are going to make the biggest difference. One which is often forgotten is the hot water solution in schools. Keep it really simple. There's often an expectation that the hot water will be available everywhere, that will be available at all times, but actually thinking, when do they really need it? And, obviously there's a big difference between, an IT room where you never would and a lab where you always would. But, what about the classrooms? How do we make sure, even going from nursery and primary schools, that we're treating those with not just a default setting, that we're actually understanding the specifics that the school needs. Then in terms of middle priority, things which will have an impact, but perhaps, are the second tier, essentially. So the efficiency of the systems that will go in. Now, there's been some fantastic work in terms of not only schools but universities decarbonising by changing the light fittings. And all of these are important, but it's just understanding the scale and the magnitude of the impact they will have. When we're looking at new build, minimizing the energy loss through the windows is fundamentally important. So really don't default to a standard system and don't default to a standard percentage, and really focus on the orientation of the facade to make sure that that is tackled from the beginning, because that's a very difficult thing to change later on in the design. And one thing that is changing, I think, in terms of how consultants are designing, how contractors are building, is the focus on maintenance and replacement, because actually that's going to be that's going to have a huge impact on how we can decarbonize the embodied carbon elements as we move through. So that's becoming an increasingly important conversation that we're now having, and that requires all of us to hold hands together and make sure that the supply chains are geared up to that kind of regime and that measuring, that we can actually make sure that we convey that in our designs. Some things which should already be happening, essentially. So that's why we've put them as not so much low priority, but standard priority, because it already should be there. So this idea of data disclosure, this idea that we have a baseline of understanding the data that's coming out of the school's design, that should be a baseline, that should be a given now. As should the demand response, in terms of it being able to understand, the peaks of the school environment and be able to adjust the systems accordingly. Similarly, electric vehicles. I think obviously some local authorities are very well forward in their plans for electric vehicles, others less so. But schools are a real opportunity to actually make that step change in terms of understanding the opportunity that gives for the community as well as for the school itself. Just a little note on the form factor. There's a lot of talk about form factor in buildings, and rightly so. But of course, in schools, just the way that schools have developed over the past 10 years or so, the form factor generally is already below 3. So that's not, whilst it's important to understand that, it's not something to get obsessed about, because just the nature of the way the briefs are developing, that should already be happening by itself. So just stepping back, so this is again an extract from the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes, and they're the 8 different topics. So the 2 carbon, water, transport, ecology, well-being, social value, and life cycle costing. So of course, life cycle costing is the economic proof of it all, but giving equal weight to all of those as we go through. And one of the things which is increasing in its the potential and the benefits and the proof of that is the well-being. How do you measure that? How do you make sure that that comes through? Now, it's something that within Atkins we've been focusing on a number of years, and well-being in our in the way we prioritize the different elements is focusing not only on the things that we've been measuring for years, like light and temperature and air quality, but also gives an opportunity to essentially measure and audit and develop and challenge the more psychological elements rather than the physiological, which are flexibility and ownership, connection, movement, and interaction. Now, there are some overlaps between the two, but some focus the subsets of kind of biophilia, some movement in terms of interaction and team building, in terms of ownership. Very powerful when you're talking about in education settings. It's my space, and I feel proud to be there. And so the toolkit that we've developed is called Human-Centered Design, and brings those elements together in a series right from the very beginning to do the survey, which it starts with, is almost like a pre-occupancy, rather than a post-occupancy questionnaire, is a pre-occupancy. How do you work? What do you do? How do we actually make sure that we provide what you need? And whilst this started in university settings, we found it phenomenally useful to talk to our clients in a slightly different way through essentially this toolkit. We've been prioritizing its use in schools lately, and that's been great to enable the young people. Secondary schools is where we've been focusing recently, is to make sure that we hear their voices coming through as to what they want, what makes them comfortable, and how we can arrange spaces to benefit them, and also the staff who are going to be using those spaces as well. An example here, although this is an HE example, the Institute of Health and Wellbeing. We used this right at the very beginning. This is a new build as part of the new Western campus for the university, and the idea of coming together as a set of different personas. These were filtered from the different responses that we got, and it allowed us to test back as we were going through the standard briefing, in terms of the space requirements and in terms of the site analysis and all of that, but to enable us to put the well-being and to test at each juncture to make sure that we were understanding what they needed, and we were testing our design responses accordingly. And also one thing which I think is worth flagging up is that all of these things are, yes, absolutely important in terms of the right thing to do, but they're also economically viable. Some work that Imperial College did for us when we were putting together the HCD tools was about understanding the link between the uplift in productivity, that giving people places that they want to be, that they feel comfortable in, the link in productivity, the impact, the financial impact, and the payback period is remarkably low. By reducing sick leave, by increasing engagement, by increasing productivity. Very happy to talk about that in more detail, but that's probably the subject for another presentation. So the idea that well-being is at the heart of all of this is really, really important, and it sits together with all the different aspects of sustainability, obviously including carbon. So if we're to step back and say, so what does that mean in terms of existing buildings? So primarily, I've been focusing on new build in the first part of the presentation, but obviously, if we are committed as the UK to carbon zero by 2050, the new challenges of the 78% by 2035 is a real challenge, and we need to absolutely understand what that means, particularly since 80% of the 2050 stock has already been built. And it's something which that the retro first, you'll see that's from the Architects Journal, and is something that we're is in the forefront of our mind as we're making the choices to how we develop and how we help clients make decisions as to whether they should build new or whether they should actually look at the stock that they have and analyze it in a serious manner to make those decisions in an analytical way. So I'm going to hand over to John now, and he's going to go through the detail of the refurb elements.
Right. Well, thank you, Helen. And I think Helen's been talking, and you'd have noticed a kind of a primary focus in terms of schools. And although my kind of background and my responsibility in terms of Atkins is around higher and further education, I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about in this half of the presentation is actually relevant to all building types and across the public sector. So, there is this journey that that we're all on in terms of towards net zero, and different institutions, whether that's a university or a local authority or a private business, is on this journey to net zero. And there is a whole conversation to be had around the definition of net zero. But I think one thing that we can all agree on, and is actually the subject of this conference, is that the climate emergency is now. And I think in all of the aspects and all the considerations that we make as designers, as building professionals, as procurers of buildings, of managers of building stock, is to always bear that in mind. And to come on to what Helen was just saying, I think we all have fundamentally a requirement to question whenever a project starts: does it have to be new build? Can we not look at repurposing or reimagining an existing building? And fundamentally around that is around, as Helen's touched on, the significant proportion that the superstructure of a building, and indeed if you then look at the envelope of a building, contributes to the total life cycle carbon of a building. And as building professionals, and particularly as architects, Helen and I are architects, we actually have a responsibility to make existing buildings wow, to move away particularly from that kind of desire for the sort of iconic new building. How do we actually make existing buildings have that factor, but also how do we work with existing buildings to make sure that they're not seen as a sort of blocker to creative and flexible workspace, and how do we work around that? And we have a responsibility for that, and that is within this context of a whole life carbon, in terms of both the operational as well as the embodied carbon that I've mentioned. And in that idea and that kind of focus on the fact that the climate emergency is now, I think what we do have to do is we have to look at what is the exam question. And if the question is decarbonisation is a priority, then when it comes to existing buildings, then maybe quite provocatively, we actually have to prioritise some of the systems, the way that we heat and the way we provide power to those buildings, because then the normal mantra, the fabric first. When we're looking at designing new buildings, we have to concentrate on getting the basics right. But I think we have to ask ourselves that question, when we're working with existing buildings, what is the priority here? And if the priority is decarbonisation, then I think we have to think about how we approach that. And we're certainly looking at that. We're being commissioned by a large body to look across their national estate, and that is something that we're looking at. But we have to be very, very careful in that journey to sort of balance it. And I'll come on to some aspects. One of those is actually the future cost of offsetting. We know what that is now when we're working through our sort of this journey to net zero, and when we're looking at what that's left once we've done everything we can, that last section about offsetting. But as we move as a country towards whether that's a 2030 target or a 2050 target, it's not in our control what that future cost of offsetting is. So it's a huge risk to not be dealing with the whole element of the building. And that's essentially about getting our beans in a row. It's about the fundamentals of reducing demand, reducing energy, reducing cost, and looking at the fabric of the building, so that when one is looking at an existing building, one might prioritize the kind of systems, but also looking at what one can do with that existing fabric to improve its performance. And the evolution of technology. Technology is constantly evolving, and it's ever becoming a challenge that when we've got a project that's being designed and is on the drawing board, actually we're always trying to keep pace with technology. And I think that's very important to actually to keep close to that and to work alongside professionals that have got that connection with industry, that know what's coming, can factor that into their design. Because again, rather provocatively said there, the future once was biomass. We always have to have an eye on as how technology changes and how priorities change, and the wider market that we have to, and the wider setting that we're in. And take, for example, the decarbonisation of the grid, the move increasingly away from obviously from gas to electricity. Let's say we rip out all of our gas infrastructure only to find out that actually that was an ideal hydrogen infrastructure. Now that's rather simplistic, but it's really to make a kind of point, a particular point. But around all of this, whatever we do in terms of those things is about getting the basics right. It's still about the fundamentals that Helen was running through, particularly with the Letty advice. One can't at this moment in time, have any kind of presentation without touching on, the current events that have all affected us over the last year, and that's, we're now in that kind of after, or hopefully we're moving towards that after COVID, and the impacts of societal and behavioural change. I mean, from day to day, there are arguments, how much are people going to be going into office, the impacts on universities, on our commuter experience, and that advice seems to change rapidly. I think what we can all agree on that there has been change. Certainly in a lot of sectors, certainly in the higher education sector in which I work, there has been a kind of fundamental impact in terms of their budgets, and that goes for a number of sectors within our society. So when one's making decisions about what one's going to do in the future, one needs to base that on very good data. This isn't about guessing. One needs to have kind of sound data to base one's predictions and one's design and one's planning and strategic planning going forward. And post-occupancy evaluations feed into that. Helen's already touched on that before, about understanding and going back and really understanding what has worked in the past. And one of the things that we're all aware of is this performance gap, that when we actually go back and we're critical and we review the buildings that have been constructed over the last 10, 15, 20 years, that actually how they were designed and how they were intended to perform and how they perform, that there is this performance gap. Now, I know the University of London, I was involved in a conference there a couple of years ago, and they did some work around this, and actually there are mechanisms and approaches one can take to look to reduce that performance gap. One particular approach, which I'm sure everybody on this webinar will be aware of, in terms of Passive House. And when we're talking about existing buildings, then there's the existing building version of Passive House, which is Enefit, and that is a kind of tried and tested approach that one can take. And as Atkins, we're actually upskilling a number of our team in terms of passive house and NFIT training, because we see that as an important tool going forward in terms of ensuring that we mitigate or significantly reduce that performance gap. Another tool that we use is the rather snastily named marginal basement cost curves, but actually it's a really useful tool that we use particularly at large scale with public sector organisations, with statutory authorities, of actually looking across their estate and actually prioritising those changes that can be made in terms of reducing their carbon emissions. But actually, in terms of those which net saving, is actually looking at those where there's going to be a net cost, actually by doing a kind of an analysis and looking at that across the whole piece as a strategic, then actually the savings that you will gain through those early and easy wins, which are on the kind of far left of the axis, can actually help you to work your way quite significantly up that list of items which have a kind of a net financial cost. So that's a tool we find particularly useful, and also incentivizing that kind of change of change on across an existing estate, across existing buildings, of actually having KPIs which identify how you're going to move forward change. And one thing that we've looked at, and we advise clients in terms of how they can engage with ESCOs, with energy service companies, because these are companies that can come along and take over the not just the design, but the installation, and then essentially the ongoing maintenance and running of those services, down to the light fittings in your buildings, as well as the major plant facilities. And they're incentivized through KPIs to run the systems more efficiently, and through doing that to equally you can incorporate KPIs around reductions in carbon emissions. Now that fundamentally, for that to work, what one needs to have is one needs to be monitoring, and that's where the Internet of Things come in, about kind of sensors, about introducing the intelligence here to constantly monitor those data and those factors of which you're monitoring and which you'll be assessing an ESCO, for example. And what that can do is that can then feed into a digital twin, and the digital twin then enables you to take in that data and to model and predict virtually how you can adapt your estate and your individual buildings. And I'll be touching on both of these as real examples in a moment. But again, coming back to the fundamentals, as one did on the last slide, it's about listening to buildings and not trying to make buildings do what they don't want to do, and that's about matching function to space. And if you could see the rest of that up behind my head, is that not all space is vanilla, and again, understanding how we use space and being sympathetic or empathetic to the building. So just a few examples here of those kind of how we're using our digital twins and other digital tools to help us and our clients on that kind of journey. So actually this is a data visualization tool for the University of Plymouth, which in this instance was actually looking at visualizing the utilization of space. But actually we're working with the University of Plymouth at the moment as to how we can use exactly the same tool to look at things about energy use, about conditions of building, to visualize that situation across. And through visualizing your estate and your buildings, it makes it much more simple and easier to engage and to move a kind of strategy forward to improving matters. Now, what's great about this was this particular tool is it actually just takes existing data. So in this case with the University of Plymouth, it took just their existing space plans and their existing Excel, just in a simple Excel form, with their data that they would have to issue to HESA to identify their use of space. So there's a number of factors, and actually it brings both of those through these various pieces of software, in-house software we have, to actually visualize that. So this wasn't actually although it looks like a 3D model, it wasn't built from surveys. It was literally generated by taking 2D data, Excel 2D drawings and data, and combining them through a piece of software to instantly visualize this. And actually through a software that we have called Icon, is that you can actually visualize that and we're working with them. So you can imagine this with EPZ ratings, with carbon emissions, with condition surveys, of very quickly pulling this information together and visualizing it. And that is a powerful tool when one's making decisions. Feeding into that, as well as those kind of manual processes of actually collecting that data on that Excel document, is working to incorporate sensors. This was the work we've been doing with a statutory company, where we've actually our colleagues in creative design actually built using simple Raspberry Pi sensors, which were installed across the building, so that we were able to gain a huge amount of data around CO2 levels and occupancy, and we could map that and we could model that, and we can actually see the movement of people, the interaction with the external envelope, and very quickly and almost in, not in this case real time, but from taking that data to play it back and actually understand and inform the kind of decision making about where we had to look at making changes within the building. And taking that to another level, Helen mentioned before about the Institute of Health and Wellbeing at University of Glasgow. This is a building which is currently on site, and this incorporates a data mesh within the floor plates. So that's actually taking your what would in the past just be your light sensors in terms of occupancy sensors about switching lights on and off, but actually giving that much more granularity and intelligence. So actually, not only is that controlling the lighting on a much more granular level, but also it's feeding back to actually provide information about the occupancy of spaces, when those spaces are occupied, what the density of occupation is. And I think, moving forward through this huge change that we've had in the use of space, having something like this is going to be hugely powerful, because actually one can see across a floor plate and across different floors and across different areas of the building very quickly to understand how people are using that building, and how you can actually manage it to maybe lock down buildings to reduce the energy within a building, and to manage it in both of its use and in terms of its systems in a much more efficient way. And then taking that to another level, in terms of some work we're doing with kind of social housing, in particular products, Ida Roth that we have. This was actually taking another level of data and sensors within the building. We're actually looking at lighting, we're looking at the kind of thermal comfort, the air quality, humidity within the kind of spaces, and actually linking that to external climatic conditions, and actually monitoring how users are adapting their controls within these kind of spaces in relative to the conditions both inside the building and outside the building. And this is actually, I mentioned before, this is actually an example which is happening in real time. We're actually able to monitor this, and again, that's kind of informing the decision making about, again, the management and the future development of the designs of housing. And again, you can imagine this equally applicable within a school environment or across a public sector estate. And then finally, Helen talked about we different scales, and we've been zooming in and out here. This is sort of zooming out to the kind of macro scale of a campus or an urban centre. Now, this is work we actually have been doing over a few years now, or recent years, in the Middle East. But actually, we're starting to do this work, and we've got a commission, for example, with the Barbican at the moment, to do this work in this country, which is actually looking at microclimate analysis and how that fundamentally can inform decision making about not only the design of buildings, but the space around buildings and the interaction between the two. So that's first of all about actually understanding the kind of context of any kind of space, whether this is part of a city, whether this is a part of a campus, and understanding the kind of key drivers in terms of the prevailing wind, the kind of the kind of standard contextual environmental analysis. But what we're able to do is, through software, is to dive into this at a much greater level, to actually look at wind speed, to look at the orientation of buildings, the actual materiality of buildings, but fundamentally materiality and the context of the environment they're in, to actually make certain assessments. So this was part of these are part of a whole series of studies that are carried out, but if one zooms into one particular one, so this actually looked at what was the impact of incorporating green roofs, adding them to the roofs of buildings, and actually green walls to the facade. So the two diagrams on the left are actually looking at that analysis, which appears very, very subtle, but when that's contrasted and the comparisons made, you can actually see some very clear examples of where, as it's highlighted here, that there were definite cooling effects, both from the green roofs and the green facades of the building, that were having a significant effect on the cooling load to these buildings. And that analysis was only one part of a whole series of studies that are able to be done. So one can actually look at bringing all of those studies together to inform the positioning of buildings on a site, their orientation, the gaps between buildings, the height of buildings relative to one another in terms of airflow and daylighting, the planting of buildings around there in terms of the positive impact they have, and the use of different finishes. And as I said, this is a piece of work that you can imagine the Middle East is kind of critical, but actually, we're seeing it can equally have a fundamental effect in the UK. And as I said, we're just starting a series of projects around that. So hopefully it's been a broad range of topics, from the very detailed and the specification to the kind of general in the middle of the presentation, to some ideas about how we can use technology and digital tools to kind of inform our decision making and our kind of journey to net zero, and as we said, the decarbonisation of education. So I think, Mark, that's it from Helen and I, and over if we've got any questions.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, both Helen and John, for that presentation. Really, really useful, really informative. And I think, you covered a hell of a lot of ground within that presentation, going from the overview right down into the detail of some of the stuff that you're doing. Lots of detail in there, and we have got a few questions, and I'm sure there'll be some more questions that come through as we discuss a few of the questions that have come in. So if anybody listening does have other questions or comments they'd like to add, please feel free to add those into the chat box, and we'll get to those as we work through the set of questions now over the few minutes that we've got left. Just before we get on to the questions, a couple of notes that Fiona's just put into the chat box as reminders that picks up on some of the things that Helen and John were talking about. So just in terms of the LETI guidance, there's a reminder that we've got Dr. Joe Jack Williams, who's discussing the LETI's Climate Emergency Design Guide. He'll be presenting at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. So if you haven't registered for that webinar, please feel free to go onto the Spaces website and register for that one. I'm sure that one will be an interesting one as well. I have sat through one of Dr. Joe's seminars before, and although I went a little bit over my head on a few bits, it was really interesting. So that'll be a good one to go to. And also another one, just in terms of some of the digital twin information that John was talking about. We had Sadaf Askari from IES. He gave a presentation on Tuesday regarding digital twins. The recording of that will be issued out to delegates and Spaces members at the end of the virtual conference for people to watch again if they didn't see that one as well. So both really, really useful ones, and do add a bit more detail into some of the things that we've been talking about this afternoon. So if we just go to some of the questions that we've had, some really useful questions and important ones that touch on some of the detail that we've been talking about. So a question from David Ravenscroft. So he said, the use of school buildings will inevitably change over time as a consequence of changes in pedagogy, technology, cohort size, and other social influences. So he's asking, how much effort should be placed on making school buildings much more flexible than they are at present? So I think probably one for you to kick off with, Helen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting topic, and obviously, post COVID, it's given us all ample time to think and really reflect on, everything from class size to circulation in schools, but also to exams and assessments. Now, the things are they're intuitively linked, and it's actually quite important that we don't try and have the conversation just in abstract. I think the DFE is moving, by moving to a kind of standard module that can then adapt to allow for, variety of flexibilities over time, I think is a good move. But I think as we're without kind of trying to get too political about this, if we continue to assess in the same way, then actually, the idea of teaching to a standard class size, which will then go through a particular pathway, I think is with us for a bit of time to come. So actually to be able to break down and use those multipliers to say, how can we engage with technology? How can we engage with the different pedagogies that teaching staff have available to them, and actually make sure that there is the opportunity. Some schools are already grasped that, and they've already used COVID as a springboard to work in a completely different manner. At the same time, we've got to be careful that it doesn't just become, oh, well, it's all about the technology and that'll save everything. Because at the end of the day, it's about the quality of teaching. There's no replacement. However you actually engage with that teacher, it's really important. But the opportunity to develop spaces which show that multidisciplinary aspect and the flow of teaching, I think is something which we need to push forward more. And I do think that the new skills which are coming through, obviously the new framework which contractors are bidding for at the moment, is going to have that at its heart in terms of the flexibility.
And also, Helen, isn't it? I mean, flexibility. Whenever I have a conversation about flexibility, there's flexibility that people immediately think of being able to adapt and change. I've always thought of flexibility as being getting the fundamentals of a building right. Yeah. So if actually you've got you start with the frame and the kind of structure of a building, you think about bringing in daylight, ventilation. You get those fundamentals. If you get the buildings that we retain and we repurpose and we imagine are the ones that got those fundamentals right. The floor to ceiling heights, the depth, allowing daylight to penetrate, to allow buildings to kind of ventilate properly, to place them on the site correctly. Those fundamental things are actually what makes buildings flexible, because the rest of it can kind of adapt. But if you've got dark areas of a building that poorly ventilate, are poorly daylit, that isn't flexibility. So I think there's the things that obviously that Helen's been talking about, but I always think flexibility comes from actually just getting some basic fundamentals right, and that gives you a broad flexibility of being able to adapt to change and to things that we can't 18 months ago we wouldn't have seen the year we've just had. So
absolutely setting the stage correctly. But then, making sure that the people who are briefing the school, so the users, the head teachers, the senior management team, the multi-academy trust, whoever it might be, the local authority, the DFE, understand the particulars for that school, because it isn't one size fits all. And we need to make sure, you can take a horse to water. We could create, fully flexible spaces. But if the teaching staff aren't engaged in that process, then it will not succeed. And so they have to go hand in hand.
That's right. And that comes to the holistic approach to everything.
Yeah.
And trying to prioritize things, and certainly how the building's going to be used and the building users is really important. Because I think the other part of that is that we've got standard approaches to new build, but then it's applying the same things or different things to repurposing and retrofit and refurbishment. If you've got an existing building that needs refurbing or repurposing, it's how do we get the best out of that in terms of all the things that we need to look at as well. And sometimes you've got to put a slightly different approach on that to get that flexibility. So it's quite a big subject to look at. I think Philip Jordan's also raised a question that's of a similar approach in terms of how are we dealing with the changes, not just in teaching, health and technology, but also with schools changing and becoming academies. So that's more to do with how the buildings get used and the functions within those and how the trusts work them, I think.
It's also the ownership, in terms of control, who has control. So traditionally, obviously, we all grew up in a time where local authorities would essentially control the system. Sorry, that sounds totally negative. I mean, I'm just stating a fact. But obviously, with the advent of academies and moving let's say the purchasing power direct to the academies themselves, be that in a MAT or be that standalone, it allows them to make different decisions. It allows them perhaps to make more long-term decisions rather than focusing on this year's budget, to actually look at it more holistically, and the opportunity to make different decisions than what they would otherwise do. From a carbon point of view, it's about investment, and it's rather than necessarily just focusing, as John was saying, if the immediate challenge is now, and the simplest way to decarbonize is actually to move to a green tariff, then that's fine, because you have, strictly speaking, decarbonized, but you're still using too much energy. But if it allows that longer term view, the longer term investment, then that's a positive thing. But we have to guide schools, we have to assist, and we have to make sure that people have that decision making template at their fingertips, so it doesn't become a kind of either or. You can actually look at the scale of the investment, in a way at a smaller scale, of what John was talking about in the marginal abatement curves, to really actually understand the impact of the investment that you're putting in.
Great.
Did you want to add anything on that, John? Or?
No, I think that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question that's coming from John Richardson, which I think is a question that gets asked quite a lot in webinars that we've been sitting on over the past few months and things. He's basically saying, are you aware if central government is looking to provide a carbon reduction budget specifically for schools to bid or apply for?
So in England, this is a multi-part answer to that. We'll start in Wales because it's easier. Because in Wales, our experience is, yes, there is, and actually that comes together in a slightly different way, and it allows the ambitious targets that Wales have set themselves to be delivered. Obviously, the funding streams, the funding mechanisms are slightly different in Wales. In England, in our experience, is that the central funding that comes through, the expectation is very much that it is deliverable for the standard cost. That's something which, as an industry, we're working through. I mean, it's not easy. We don't know the answer. Collectively, if we did, we'd be doing it to every project. But in our experience, that local authorities who are involved, if the funding comes through a local authority, they'll often look at their own climate emergency targets or whatever that they've signed up to themselves, and boost it in that respect. So it depends on which way the funding is coming. But in our experience, there's a huge demand, there's a huge ambition, and people understand the implications, particularly because you can't retrofit all the embodied carbon challenges, and we don't want to give people the MATs or the local authorities or whoever the funding the funder is, we don't want to give them a problem in 5 or 6 years' time, to say, look, you now have to be embodied carbon neutral, and so to be able to have that route at the beginning, and to impress upon our clients the importance of the decision making now, and that's why we need to look slightly more longer term, because we all know that capital is king, but the transfer between program, carbon, and cost has now changed the alignment of that triangle, and we know that we have to make those decisions now. So in terms of the funding and how we structure that opportunity, obviously we've got to prove it and it's got to work. But the brave decisions I think that the DfE have made is actually making the ambition for the 2021 specification to be carbon neutral in operation, and then 2025 to be carbon neutral embodied is incredibly powerful. And I think that sets a baseline for us all to say, right, we're going to hold hands together and we're going to make this work, because we have to. There is no other choice.
I suppose, Helen, that those relate to the new build schools in terms of the output specification. I don't know if with John, in terms of retrofitting and adaptation of existing schools. I know within universities we've had the Salix funding, and there's been particularly around Christmas time with some of the targets around January, there was sort of a push on funding bids that went in around that. I don't know in schools. I'm not aware that there was a similar, or has been a similar funding mechanism, is there? in terms of existing?
No. I mean, obviously that's been a huge boost forward, and I think it will make a difference. But yeah, the expectation is not quite matched in terms of, like you say, for the new build. Yeah.
Yeah, the good point about the retrofitting on that, John, and Declan Douglas has raised a point as well, with the same ilk, saying retrofitting comes with risk. Councils and the DfE are understandably risk averse, and how can we encourage them to look beyond the easy options in terms of the financial pen pushers when you review their existing stock, when there are higher risks and higher costs and increased problems? Is this a risk only the private sector is willing to take? He's suggesting they're converting offices into homes, etc. Or is there a way to discuss this right to the top of the decision makers? I mean,
I think interestingly there, Mark, it comes to as we're moving towards 2050 and and the climate merging, the priorities that Helen touched on just a second ago, the priorities are shifting, aren't they? What we if you're making, in the past you'd have made decisions about energy and and payback. That's a different thing. When you turn around, you say, actually, what one of my significant criteria here is carbon, then actually existing buildings and reusing existing buildings. And I think I know with university clients that there's been a real push on in terms of operational use of energy, but actually increasingly they're now shifting to the embodied carbon. And I think that's, when you manage that risk, isn't it? You're actually saying, well, what's the risk? The risk here is that we're in a climate emergency, and therefore actually that shifts one's perception, and one says, well, actually in the past, and we've all done it, I've been involved in projects over my career where we've just said, Joe, what, with all the hassle of keeping that existing building, it's going to be cheaper to knock it down and start again. Those kind of conversations are changing and have to change, and therefore one is, you can't get around the fact that working with an existing building is riskier and more challenging, because it just is. So as building professionals, we've got to support our clients in managing that better, in getting in early to carry out assessments of those buildings and put in the right mechanisms to manage that risk and take the right approach with the building. And that comes back to the little sketch with the ear about listening to the building. Don't try and make a building do something it can't do. So I think we just kind of need to have a little bit of a rewire in our thinking, I think.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. Do you have anything to add on that, Helen?
No, I think it's as 2050 will be upon us before we know it, and we have to tackle it. So it's not something that we can leave till later on. And the fact that the DfE and schools are being guinea pigged to move that decision making forward, I think is phenomenal. It's just then getting the balance between the existing buildings, and that is something which we have to continue to research, to explain, to debate with clients, and to demonstrate to them that yes, it may be cheaper now, but you will still have that problem to come. That legislation is on its way, and it's not going to change, and we can't ignore it, and it'll only become more expensive if you try and do it in the future. Yeah,
that's right. I think it's tackle it now. Don't leave a problem to try and sort out later on, or for somebody else to deal with. We all have to take the challenge now and deal with the problems now and try and get it right for the future generations.
Yeah.
Just moving on, conscious of time, so just trying to move on to pick up a few more of these questions. Nicola Booth's come up with asking if we're in agreement with a comment she's made in terms of greening buildings can come under challenge in respect of fire risk and the findings from the Dame Hackett report. So careful consideration should be applied when thinking of how and where we're greening the fabric, and how important that is. And she's asking if we agree with that.
I mean, I just noticed, Mark, actually what's helpful there, Fiona's just popped into the chat pane there about a talk that Dr. Hirewell Davis is giving from CIBSE on Tuesday the 15th around this very topic, the kind of Dame Hackett review and zero carbon. So that's a useful pointer there from Fiona. there, Nicola. So that would be a good talk to attend to. And there are challenges. We talked about embodied carbon. The superstructure, Helen's there. 31%. CLT. There's a debate around that in terms of the use of these materials. So there are challenges here. I mean, I try to always try and keep these things simple. It's about getting the fundamentals right. If we as designers and constructors, we design our buildings properly and we construct them properly, then that should manage those risks. But then that goes through the whole process of us working collaboratively about using systems that manage the quality of both our design, our coordination, and our construction, isn't it? And that's how we'll continue and will become increasingly important as we meet these challenges, that in the process we build our buildings properly. And we design
that golden thread. That golden thread, which
exactly.
goes right through from the design inception right through to the construction. Because whilst I'm sure we could spend hours talking about Grenfell and the horrors of that and what's come out of it and how we as an industry have changed our perception of things, the opportunity, it's not just about the products themselves, it's about how they're put together, it's about the mechanisms that we have for checking that. And then it's the economics of insurance. Interestingly, if you look at the kind of Zurich guidebook for construction of schools, which obviously hasn't actually been updated since Grenfell, since the new, and it won't be until the new legislation comes through Parliament. It'll be interesting to see how that, at the moment, there's an awful lot of fear in terms of what won't be possible. But I think the balance between the risk to life, which obviously is never acceptable, but also the long-term risks of, if we don't tackle the carbon challenge now, then we're going to have an even bigger problem. So it's not going to go away, and we do need to keep having that conversation. But I think, picking up the conversation on Friday will be useful.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you both for that. Our hour is up, so we could spend a lot more time talking about this subject, but as we only had an hour, that's now up. So I think we've got through the comments that have come through. Just one more that Fiona's put in there in terms of BB100 is now out for consultation. So I'm sure quite a lot of people have been looking at that and poring over that and reading through it. I myself have been having a look at that and making some comments on it, along with some of my other colleagues. So that's going to be a useful one to look at as well. But no, apologies, our hour is up, so we need to bring the presentation to a close now. So
well, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Indeed.
And thanks for engaging.
If I just thank you everybody for attending the webinar. And again, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the two presenters, Helen and John, for providing us with a great presentation there, but also to our sponsors, once again, Atkins, Faithful and Gould, IES, NPS Group, and Wilmot Dixon for their support in supporting the virtual conference. Can I also thank Fiona, who's been working in the background as well, just ensuring that everything is working and running smoothly today and will be throughout the conference as well. And then can I just say, could we please take a few seconds at the end of the webinar just to answer the feedback question that should be coming up on your screen if it hasn't been already shortly. And then on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent, if you could just rate this webinar, please, that's really useful. We appreciate the feedback that comes back.
Please, not too many ones.
I was going to say, don't get it the long way around.
And then just a reminder that all the webinars over the 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded onto the Spaces YouTube channel at the end of the conference. The recordings are available to delegates and Spaces members only, and a link will be sent to you at the end of the conference as well. So thank you all for your time this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we hope to see you again at some of the forthcoming webinars over the course of the conference. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks all. Cheers.